The scent of burnt commissary coffee, industrial floor wax, and freshly pressed high-gloss starch always settled into the back of Major Aaron Callahan's throat, long before her conscious mind processed the physical reality of a military promotion hall, a sensory anchor that tied her 18 years of grueling service to a singular, echoing moment of profound isolation. Standing inside the packed, dimly lit ceremony room at Fort Meade in full-dress blues, her posture was mathematically perfect, every ribbon positioned precisely 1/8 of an inch above the left pocket seam. Yet her eyes kept drifting back to the middle row, where 2 empty metal folding chairs sat like open wounds, amidst a sea of weeping grandmothers, proud fathers adjusting their sons' stiff collars, and chaotic toddlers scrambling over polished leather shoes. Her uniform felt like a heavy protective cage designed to hold together a skeleton that had been fractured by years of emotional neglect, a physical manifestation of a career built out of spite and survival, rather than the nurtured encouragement her peers had taken for granted since their days at West Point. Just 3 days prior, her father had looked up from a half-eaten plate of meatloaf, his eyes reflecting the dull glow of a television screen broadcasting a baseball game he didn't care about, and shrugged with an indifference that was more violent than any screamed insult, muttering that they weren't going to waste good gas, and a perfectly fine Thursday night driving down to witness a pathetic little ceremony for a rank that didn't even come with a real corporate bonus. That memory vibrated in her ears now, drowning out the low hum of the gathering crowd and the rhythmic clicking of heels against the linoleum floor, a stark reminder that in the Callahan household, achievement was never celebrated, unless it could be deposited directly into a bank account or used to leverage a social favor with the parish council at St. Jude's. The only presence anchoring her to the room was Hank, her 72-year-old neighbor and a retired Army Master Sergeant who walked with a heavy cane that groaned under his weight every time the Maryland humidity spiked, sitting quietly in the very back row with a lukewarm Dunkin' Donuts cup cradled in his calloused hands, offering a solitary, knowing nod that almost dismantled her composure more thoroughly than the empty seats ever could. When Colonel Ruiz stepped up to the podium, his voice cutting through the ambient chatter like a blade, Aaron swallowed the lump of glass in her throat and stepped forward, her leather shoes snapping against the floor with a hollow sound that seemed to echo across the 20 years she had spent running away from the gray, suffocating streets of Akron, Ohio. The gold oak leaves of a major are heavy, far heavier than the silver bars of a captain or the brass tracks of a lieutenant, carrying with them the invisible weight of staff meetings, operational accountability, and the quiet realization that you are no longer just leading soldiers but managing the cold, bureaucratic machinery of national defense. As Colonel Ruiz pinned the insignias onto her shoulders, his fingers were steady, his eyes locked onto hers with a deep, professional respect that she had spent her entire adult life trying to extract from the man who shared her last name, whispering a brief private commendation about how she made the regiment proud before stepping back to salute. The applause that followed was loud, standard, and entirely collective, a wall of sound generated by strangers who were celebrating their own loved ones, but graciously extending a fraction of their joy to the solitary woman standing center stage under the harsh fluorescent lights. Hank whistled loudly from the back, his cane thumping against the floorboards in a rhythmic, military cadence that brought a fleeting, genuine smile to her face, a brief intermission in the heavy internal monologue that had been playing in her mind since she first put on the uniform as an enlisted analyst nearly 2 decades ago. Outside the hall, the November wind was sharp, cutting through the thin fabric of her dress blues as families gathered around the flagpoles to take group photos, popping cheap champagne from plastic coolers and laughing as the corks bounced off the hoods of parked sedans in direct violation of base regulations. Aaron stood off to the side, her fingers tightly gripping a small, square cardboard box that contained her discarded captain's bars, watching a young first lieutenant being engulfed in a massive, tearful embrace by his extended family, while a grandmother handed him an arrangement of flowers that was larger than his torso. The contrast was almost comical, a stark illustration of the emotional economy she had been forced to navigate, where every ounce of her success had to be self-generated, self-validated, and locked away in a private vault where her family's chronic disapproval could never reach it or diminish its value. Sitting alone in the driver's seat of her Honda Pilot inside the dark, concrete cavern of the Fort Meade parking garage, Aaron didn't turn on the engine for 40 minutes, choosing instead to sit in the heavy silence while the cold steering wheel chilled her palms and the faint smell of exhaust drifted through the cracked window. Her knees throbbed with a dull arthritic ache that was the permanent souvenir of airborne school, and 12 months spent hauling 70 pounds of body armor through the rocky, unforgiving terrain of the Hindu Kush, a physical price she had willingly paid to buy her independence from a home where love was always treated as a scarce commodity with a fluctuating interest rate. She pulled out her phone, her thumb hovering over her mother's contact information for a long, agonizing minute, watching the digital cursor blink against the screen like a tiny, mocking heartbeat, before she finally realized that she was still waiting for an apology that would never come from people who had already decided who she was before she even learned how to march. To them, she was simply the difficult, stubborn daughter who had ruined their holiday schedules by enlisting instead of marrying a local insurance salesman and settling down within a 4-mile radius of the Akron city limits to provide convenient grandbabies and reliable free labor for family barbecues. With a sudden cold surge of clarity that felt like snapping a frozen branch, she deleted her mother's contact card from the device, listening to the high-pitched hum of the garage's overhead lights and whispering to the empty passenger seat that this milestone, this rank and this life were things she had built entirely with her own blood, completely separate from the people who only remembered her existence when they needed a roof repaired or a tax form decoded. 6 weeks later, the world changed in a way that had nothing to do with military tactics and everything to do with the cheap, superficial currency of public relations, stemming from a routine cybersecurity briefing at the Pentagon regarding critical infrastructure vulnerabilities that was covered by a staff photographer for the Washington Post. Aaron wasn't even the subject of the article. She was positioned 3 feet to the left of a senior defense official, caught mid-motion while reviewing an operational ledger, her expression intense and unyielding, while 2 stone-faced, armed security personnel stood directly behind her shoulder under the stark, dramatic lighting of the briefing theater. The photograph captured a specific brand of government mystique, the anonymous, powerful operator working in the shadows of the nation's capital, and within 12 hours of its publication online, the digital shockwaves traveled across the Appalachian Mountains and exploded directly into the old, insulated Catholic neighborhoods of West Akron. Suddenly, old church acquaintances, who hadn't spoken to her parents since the Clinton administration, were calling the house. Neighbors were stopping by the driveway to comment on the prestigious news clipping, and distant cousins were sharing the article on social media with captions that claimed an intimacy with Aaron that had never existed in reality. The telephone in her Alexandria townhouse began ringing late on a Tuesday evening, the caller ID displaying an unfamiliar Ohio area code that she answered with her standard, clipped military greeting, only to be met with her mother's voice, which was uncharacteristically warm, dripping with a performative sweetness that tasted like synthetic honey. "Honey, why on earth didn't you tell us you were doing something this important?" Her mother trilled, her voice elevated to a pitch usually reserved for winning a raffle, immediately launching into a detailed recitation of how the ladies at the St. Bernardin Altar Society could not stop talking about how important and powerful her daughter looked in the national newspaper, completely skipping over any inquiry into her health, her life, or the promotion ceremony they had explicitly boycotted a month prior. Leaning against her kitchen counter, while watching the late autumn rain streak across the glass windows of her apartment, Aaron listened to her mother speak, feeling a complicated, messy knot of emotion tighten in her chest, a toxic mixture of lingering childhood longing and profound, adult disgust at the transparency of the manipulation. Her mother wasn't proud of her daughter's 18 years of sacrifice, her strategic acumen, or her defense of the country. She was infatuated with the audience reaction, thrilled by the sudden, unexpected influx of social status that Aaron's anonymous image had brought to their mundane, fiercely competitive suburban circle. "Your father has been showing that newspaper clipping to every single person who walks into the hardware store," her mother continued, laughing softly as if they were old co-conspirators sharing a delightful family secret, rather than two people estranged by decades of emotional neglect. Her tone shifting into that artificial, casual cadence that Aaron knew signaled an impending request. The trap was laid with exquisite care, a narrative web constructed out of sudden, unearned affection, with her mother explaining that Dany's children had been asking all about their famous Aunt Aaron from Washington, and how the whole family was dying to have her come home for a proper, celebratory weekend dinner so everyone could see her in her element. Aaron kept her voice perfectly flat, a trained weapon of professional detachment, stating that it was simply a standard press briefing and that her daily work was mostly tedious data analysis. But her mother brushed the explanation aside, insistence hardening beneath the velvet exterior of her voice as she demanded a firm arrival date, capitalizing on the psychological leverage of the photograph to force in compliance that years of guilt trips had failed to achieve. When the call finally ended, Aaron stood in the dark kitchen for an hour, the cold tile floor chilling her bare feet while she stared at the glowing screen of her laptop where the Washington Post article was pulled up, studying her own face in the image with a sense of profound alienation as she realized that she had suddenly become useful to people who had spent her entire youth treating her like an inconvenient footnote. The realization sat heavy and toxic in her stomach, a dense weight that reminded her of the early days of her divorce from Jason, when she had realized that some people only love you for the version of themselves they see reflected in your eyes, and once that reflection stops being flattering, they abandon the mirror without a second thought. 2 days later, the second wave of the assault arrived in the form of a text message from her brother Dany, the first communication from him in over 8 months, consisting of a casual, breezy greeting that completely ignored his long silence, punctuated by an immediate, shameless request for a small favor involving business logistics when she came home for the weekend. Dany had always possessed an almost supernatural talent for failing upward, a golden child whose serial business bankruptcies, messy divorces, and frequent encounters with local law enforcement were always categorized by their parents as the tragic results of a bad economy, untrustworthy partners, or manipulative women, while Aaron's minor infractions were treated as character flaws bordering on treason. She didn't reply to the message, setting the phone face down on her desk and attempting to submerge herself in an avalanche of classified threat intelligence reports. But the crawling sensation in her gut remained, a persistent, instinctual warning that a storm was brewing in Ohio, and she was being positioned to act as the lightning rod. The true nature of the storm revealed itself on a Thursday morning while Aaron was walking out of a secure, compartmented information facility in the basement of the Pentagon, her work phone vibrating against her hip with an internal, unlisted number that she answered with her standard professional protocol, expecting a routine inquiry from the logistics desk, but instead meeting the icy, measured cadence of an investigator from Pentagon Legal Affairs. "Major Callahan, this is Special Counsel Warren," the voice said. The words stripped of all human warmth, possessed of that specific, terrifying neutrality that only exists within the higher echelons of military jurisprudence, requesting that she report to an empty briefing room down the hall immediately for an urgent, sensitive matter regarding an active federal procurement investigation. Her blood pressure spiked, a cold sweat breaking out across her collarbones as she stepped into the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridor, her mind racing through her active operations, her budget approvals, and her personnel files, searching for some administrative anomaly or operational oversight that could have triggered the scrutiny of the Judge Advocate General's office. When she entered the room, the investigator didn't offer a seat or a pleasantry. He simply laid a heavy manila folder on the polished wood table and opened it to reveal a stack of corporate correspondence, purchase orders, and recommendation letters bearing the official letterhead of Callahan Marine Supply and Logistics, a struggling commercial entity operated out of a dilapidated warehouse near the Akron canals by her brother Dany. Your name, rank, and specific Pentagon office have surfaced as the primary verification source for several high-value defense subcontracts under review for fraudulent representation, Special Counsel Warren stated. His eyes locked onto hers with a clinical intensity that made her feel as though she were being dissected under a microscope, his hand sliding the top document across the table toward her trembling fingers. Aaron looked down at the paper, and the air left her lungs in a sharp, painful gasp as she stared at her own signature, perfectly forged, down to the slight tilt of the capital A, and the specific military abbreviation format she only used on official security clearances, authorizing her brother's company as a preferred domestic vendor for specialized marine components required by the Atlantic Fleet. The documents were a masterpiece of white-collar deception, featuring forged security clearance verifications, fabricated character references written on simulated Department of Defense letterhead, and explicit claims that Major Aaron Callahan was personally overseeing the quality control metrics of the subcontracts from her desk at the Pentagon. "I didn't write this," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly before her military training reasserted control, her spine stiffening as she looked the investigator dead in the eye and repeated the statement with absolute, unyielding clarity. "Sir, I have never seen these documents in my life. I have never authorized my brother to use my name, and I have absolutely no financial or operational investment in his commercial enterprises." The investigator's expression softened by a fraction of a millimeter, a subtle shift that indicated he had expected this response, but was bound by the cold reality of federal procedure, explaining that while forensic document analysis was already underway to verify the forgery, the political sensitivity of the contracts meant that her security clearance was being placed under an administrative review, effective immediately. The words felt like a series of physical blows. The suspension of her clearance meant she would be barred from her operational vault. Her career path would be frozen. Her upcoming deployment evaluations would be cancelled. And if the investigators found even a shred of evidence suggesting she had prior knowledge of the scheme, her pension, her rank, and her honorable discharge would vanish into thin air. Until the Defense Criminal Investigative Service completes its field interviews in Ohio, you are ordered to avoid any direct communication regarding these contracts with the individuals involved, Warren instructed, closing the folder with a heavy snap that sounded like a cell door locking shut, leaving her alone in the sterile room with the realization that her brother hadn't just asked for a favor. He had stolen her life's work to collateralize a corporate lie. That evening, Aaron drove through the driving rain to a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood in Arlington where Colonel Ruiz lived, a community populated by retired flag officers and senior bureaucrats whose manicured lawns and organized garages reflected a lifetime of adherence to structural order. Seeking the counsel of the one mentor who had never lied to her, Ruiz listened to her story in absolute silence, sitting at his kitchen table with a cold cup of black coffee between his hands, his weathered face showing no surprise, only a deep, ancient sadness that she recognized as the look a commander gives when reviewing a casualty list before an unwinnable battle. "You know what the worst part is, sir," Aaron said, her voice shaking with an exhaustion that went down to her marrow, her eyes staring at the linoleum floor as she admitted that she wasn't even shocked by her brother's criminality, only devastated by the realization that her family had viewed her success not as a point of pride, but as an asset to be liquidated for Dany's convenience. Ruiz leaned forward, his voice low and steady as he told her that in intelligence work, the most dangerous adversary is never the one who threatens you from across the trenches, but the one who suddenly smiles after discovering your utility, instructing her that she needed to stop treating this as a family crisis and start treating it as a hostile counterintelligence operation designed to compromise her position. With her clearance suspended and her career hanging by a thread, Aaron spent the next 48 hours working with a private military defense council, downloading every email, text message, and financial record she possessed into a secure server to prove her total separation from Dany's fraudulent network, building a wall of digital evidence that would shield her from the impending federal indictment. When her mother called again on Saturday morning, her voice tightly wound with an underlying panic that she was trying desperately to mask behind a barrage of questions about what kind of cake Aaron wanted for her welcome dinner, Aaron played the role of the dutiful, unsuspecting daughter, agreeing to fly into Cleveland Hopkins Airport the following Friday for the family gathering. She booked a flight under her civilian name, packed her full-dress uniform in a heavy garment bag, along with the encrypted tablet containing the complete file of forged subcontracts, and prepared herself to travel into the heart of the enemy territory, knowing that this trip would not be a reconciliation, but an extraction. The flight over the snow-dusted ridges of the Pennsylvania mountains was turbulent, the aircraft bouncing through gray, heavy clouds that mirrored the suffocating dread settling into Aaron's chest as she stared out the small window, her mind endlessly rehearsing the upcoming confrontation like an operative reviewing a high-risk drop site. She knew the layout of her parents' split-level house on the west side of Akron better than any military map, a place where the wallpaper hadn't changed since 1998, and where every corner was haunted by the memories of the quiet, invisible girl who had learned to hide in plain sight, to escape the radar of her father's volatile moods and her mother's conditional affection. As the plane touched down on the wet runway, the screech of the tires felt like the opening bell of a match she had been preparing for her entire life, a definitive boundary marker between the person she had been forced to be in that house and the officer she had become in the service of something greater than her bloodline. Driving a silver rental sedan down Market Street toward her childhood neighborhood, Aaron observed the slow industrial decay of Akron with the detached eye of a tourist, noting the rusted skeletons of the old rubber factories and the boarded-up storefronts that sat like missing teeth along the gray, rain-slicked boulevards under a low permanent sky that looked like wet concrete. The city felt small, heavy, and static, a physical manifestation of the emotional gravity that had kept her family trapped in a cycle of petty grievances and superficial social competition for 3 generations, a place where time didn't progress so much as it simply accumulated layer after layer of dust and resentment. When she turned onto her parents' street, she noticed the faded American flag hanging limp from the porch bracket and the cracked concrete driveway where Dany's oversized, black pickup truck was already parked, its tires caked in mud and its exhaust pipe modified to roar with a false, performative masculinity that matched his business philosophy perfectly. Before her car engine had even stopped turning, the front door of the house flew open and her mother hurried down the steps into the drizzling cold, her arms outstretched and her face frozen in a wide, desperate smile that didn't reach her anxious, darting eyes engulfing Aaron in a tight, performative embrace that smelled of cheap lavender perfume and stale cigarettes. "Oh, look at you. Look at how important my big Washington daughter is," her mother cried, her voice raised loud enough for the neighbors across the street to hear as she reached out to grab the garment bag containing the uniform, her touch lingering on the heavy fabric as if she were inspecting a piece of valuable real estate she had just acquired through a tax loophole. Inside, the house was an oppressive time capsule of wood polish, boiled pot roast and ancient carpet fibers, the air thick with the domestic familiarity that usually brings comfort, but to Aaron felt like an atmospheric pressure chamber designed to crush her ribcage and force her back into the role of the submissive, silent teenager who never spoke unless spoken to. Her father walked out of the kitchen with a half-empty can of local beer in his hand, his posture slightly stooped by age, but his expression still carrying that familiar, defensive arrogance that had defined his authority in the home, shouting a boisterous, unnatural greeting about the Pentagon celebrity, finally gracing them with her presence, before planting a rough, dry kiss on her forehead that felt completely foreign. On the cherrywood coffee table in the center of the living room, sitting directly beneath a cheap plaster crucifix, was the framed clipping of the Washington Post article, positioned like a holy relic on an altar, surrounded by several printed sheets of paper that Aaron immediately recognized as Dany's latest corporate brochures, an unholy alliance of national prestige and white-collar desperation that made her stomach turn with a sudden, violent wave of nausea. Dany arrived in the kitchen 20 minutes later, wearing a faded local sports hoodie that stretched over his soft, beer-softened midsection, his demeanor vibrating with a manic, high-energy charm that Aaron knew from childhood meant he had either just stolen something or was about to ask someone to help him hide it, throwing his arms around her shoulders with a loud, theatrical declaration of sibling love that made the skin on the back of her neck crawl with an intense biological revulsion. "There she is, the smartest girl in the military-industrial complex," Dany shouted, clapping his hands together as he pulled up a stool at the kitchen island, immediately launching into an aggressive, fast-spoken monologue about global supply chain disruptions, transportation logistics, and the massive, historic opportunities that were waiting for domestic suppliers who had the right connections inside the federal procurement offices. Aaron watched him with the clinical, unblinking focus of an interrogation officer, noting the subtle tremor in his fingers as he reached for a bottle of water, the way his eyes constantly shifted toward their father for reinforcement, and the light film of sweat that had broken out along his hairline despite the chilly draft blowing through the kitchen window. "You know, Aaron, business down here is all about leverage," her father chimed in, leaning against the counter and pointing the base of his beer can toward her face with an aggressive familiarity that made her jaw clench, his voice dropping into that heavy, authoritative rumble he used when he was about to deliver a lecture on family loyalty and the sacred duty of children to support their father's legacy and their brother's future. Dany's been working himself to the bone, trying to expand that marine supply outfit, getting local contracts, creating jobs, making the Callahan name mean something real in this county again. But these government bureaucrats in Columbus and Washington, they don't care about small businesses. They just want red tape and endless paperwork designed to strangle a guy before he can even get a boat in the water. Aaron remained perfectly still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her voice a model of dangerous, low-register calm as she asked Dany directly, without an ounce of emotion, to explain exactly what kind of paperwork he had been filing with the Naval Logistics Command over the last 6 months to secure his new warehouse line of credit. The kitchen grew suddenly quiet, the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway sounding like a countdown timer, as Dany laughed nervously, waving his hand in a dismissive circular motion while explaining that it was just standard corporate boilerplate. A few routine capability statements and professional references, where he might have slightly highlighted his close, personal relationship with a high-level operational officer in the Pentagon Cyber Command, to give his bids a competitive edge over the massive multinational conglomerates. "It's just creative resume writing, Aaron. Everybody does it in the commercial sector. It's how you get your foot in the door so you can actually prove you can do the job," Dany stuttered, his charm beginning to flake off like cheap paint to reveal the raw, trembling panic of a con man who realizes he has just stepped into a room with an actual investigator, his voice rising in pitch as he pleaded with her to understand that he was only trying to protect his kid's future and keep the family business from going under in a brutal, unforgiving market. The true depth of the betrayal became clear on Saturday afternoon when Aaron, while walking down the basement stairs to find an extra blanket, froze on the wooden steps as her father's voice floated upward through the floorboards, cold, sharp, and entirely stripped of the performative affection he had been weaponizing since her arrival, telling her mother in a low, furious hiss that they needed to make sure Aaron signed the corporate affidavit Dany had prepared before she left on Sunday night, regardless of what kind of administrative excuses she tried to make about her military regulations. What else does she have to worry about anyway? Her father snorted, the sound dripping with a profound, lifelong contempt that cut through Aaron's remaining illusions like an oxyacetylene torch. She's divorced. She's got no kids. She's got a pile of government money sitting in a federal bank account doing nothing for this family. And she owes her brother for all the years he stayed here in Akron, looking after us while she was off playing soldier in the desert, and pretending she's better than the people who raised her. Her mother's response was a nervous, high-pitched flutter, an anxious whisper, wondering what would happen if Aaron discovered that the affidavit was a legally binding document that claimed she had full, prior knowledge of the subcontracts and had personally vetted the vendor applications from her office, a signature that would effectively transfer all criminal and civil liability for the forgery away from Dany and directly onto her own military record. If she won't help her own blood when the chips are down, then she isn't a Callahan, and will make damn sure every person at St. Jude's, every neighbor on this block, and every old friend she has left in this town knows that she turned her back on her brother's children just to save her own precious government hide, her father growled, the finality of his words echoing in the damp air of the basement, sealing the realization in Aaron's mind that she wasn't a guest in this house. She was an intended sacrifice on the altar of her brother's incompetence. Standing on the dark stairs, surrounded by old boxes of Christmas decorations and her brother's discarded high school sports trophies, Aaron felt something inside her chest go completely cold and still, a sensation of profound, crystalline clarity that wiped away 20 years of psychological programming and replaced it with the tactical, unyielding focus of a counter-offensive operation. She quietly retreated up the steps, walked out to her rental car under the pretense of getting a notebook, and drove to a deserted parking lot behind a shuttered department store near the interstate, where she pulled out her secure tablet, dialed the direct line for the Defense Criminal Investigative Service field office in Cleveland, and told the duty agent that she was ready to provide a full, sworn statement along with the physical coordinates of the primary suspect and the location of the forged corporate records. The setting for the final act was Dany's house, a sprawling, poorly constructed suburban McMansion located on a cul-de-sac on the affluent edge of the city, a property that epitomized the artificial success he had been projecting for years, with a manicured front lawn decorated with oversized plastic holiday skeletons that had been left to rot in the cold rain because nobody had the discipline to take them down after October ended. The Sunday dinner had been framed by her mother as a grand, joyful family reunion, inviting aunts, uncles, and distant cousins from across the county to create a dense crowd, a human shield of witnesses that Dany hoped would pressure Aaron into a state of emotional compliance through the sheer weight of public expectation and performative family solidarity. When Aaron arrived at 4 in the afternoon, she didn't wear her civilian clothes. She stepped out of the rental car dressed in her full army service uniform, her major's oak leaves catching the dull grey light of the afternoon sky, her chest decorated with 4 rows of operational ribbons that represented a lifetime of actual achievement that couldn't be bought, forged, or bargained away in a suburban kitchen. The effect of the uniform was immediate and profound, causing the casual conversations near the garage to stumble and stall as her cousins stared at her with a mixture of discomfort and sudden, unearned respect, their eyes tracking the sharp, military creases of her slacks and the gleaming leather of her low quarters as she walked up the driveway with a thick, leather-bound operational folder gripped tightly under her left arm like a weapon system. Inside the house was a chaotic engine of standard Midwestern hospitality, a football game blaring from a massive television screen in the living room, aluminum catering trays of baked ziti filling the air with the smell of cheap garlic and burnt cheese, and beer bottles accumulating on the granite countertops while uncles argued about local politics and children ran screaming through the narrow hallways. Her mother rushed toward her with an expression of acute panic, her eyes dropping to the folder under Aaron's arm before she whispered in a desperate, pleading tone that Aaron needed to keep things calm today, pleading with her not to bring any of her rigid military intensity into a beautiful family dinner that Dany had worked so hard to pay for. "There she is, my beautiful Pentagon daughter, the cyber warrior," her father announced loudly, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the living room as he pulled her into a rigid, uncomfortable side hug for the benefit of 3 church elders who were standing near the fireplace, his chest puffing out with a proud paternal ownership that he had never earned, introducing her as if she were a prize mare he had personally bred and trained for the international stage. Aaron stood perfectly straight within his grasp, her voice cool and steady as she corrected his exaggerations, stating her exact title and branch with a professional clarity that made the church elders nod, with a respect that her father immediately tried to capitalize on, launching into a fabricated story about how Aaron had always been an extraordinary, disciplined child who owed her strategic mind to the strict, traditional values she had been taught in his household. Dany emerged from the kitchen holding 2 beers, his face flushed and his shirt damp with sweat despite his loud, booming laughter, shouting that his sister was undoubtedly the most valuable asset the Department of Defense had in its inventory, his eyes locked onto hers with a desperate, predatory intensity that screamed for an unspoken alliance before the trap could snap shut on his neck. The dinner dragged on for 2 agonizing hours, a masterclass in psychological warfare, where every compliment dropped by a relative felt like an additional link in a chain they were trying to wrap around her wrists, with Dany continuously directing the conversation toward his future government contracts, his expanding fleet of trucks, and the vital importance of having trusted family members in high places who understand the value of mutual support and corporate protection. Aaron sat at the long dining table, surrounded by the remnants of mashed potatoes and cheap wine, her face a mask of polite indifference, watching her mother offer anxious smiles from the head of the table, while her father repeatedly raised his glass to toast the Callahan family legacy, declaring that as long as they stood together, no outside force, no government agency, and no economic downturn could ever break them. It was a beautiful, completely hollow piece of domestic theater, a collective hallucination sustained by people who preferred a comfortable lie to an inconvenient truth. And as her father lowered his glass, looking at her with an expectant, demanding glare that signaled it was time for her to give her verbal consent to the affidavit, Aaron set her fork down with a sharp, clear click that seemed to stop the rotation of the room. "Actually," Aaron said, her voice dropping into a low, resonant register that instantly cut through the clinking of silverware and the background chatter of the children, her eyes tracking across the faces of her aunts, her uncles, and her cousins until they locked directly onto her brother's pale, glistening face. "There is an administrative matter regarding the family business that everyone in this room needs to see, because it involves the official integrity of the uniform I am currently wearing and the legal standing of every person sitting at this table." The room went dead silent, the sudden absence of sound so absolute that the muffled roar of the crowd from the television in the other room felt like a distant ocean, her mother's smile freezing into a grotesque mask of terror, while her father's face darkened with a rapid, purple surge of fury as Aaron opened the heavy leather folder and pulled out 20 pages of high-resolution, color copies of the forged procurement letters and vendor applications. She slid the documents down the center of the table, watching them scatter across the white tablecloth like a deck of marked cards, her voice remaining perfectly flat, calm, and mathematically precise, as she explained to the gathered family that 3 weeks ago, she had discovered that her name, her signature, and her military rank had been systematically stolen and forged to secure millions of dollars in fraudulent federal defense subcontracts for Callahan Marine Supply. "Dany didn't just write a bad reference," Aaron continued, her words falling like iron spikes into the silence of the room as several cousins leaned forward to look at the forged signatures. "He impersonated a federal officer, fabricated Department of Defense authorization codes, and attempted to legally bind my office to his commercial liabilities, an act of felony fraud that has already triggered a comprehensive investigation by the Defense Criminal Investigative Service and placed my entire career under administrative jeopardy." "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Dany exploded, his chair screeching violently against the hardwood floor as he stood up, his face transforming from a mask of false charm into a twisted, desperate, snarled expression of pure cornered animal rage, his fist slamming into the edge of the table hard enough to rattle the wine glasses as he accused her of being a cold, heartless traitor who had gone behind her own brother's back to ruin his life over a few pieces of routine corporate paperwork. "I was trying to save this family," Dany screamed, his voice cracking with a high-pitched panic that revealed the total collapse of his ego, pointing a shaking finger at her major's insignia and shouting that she thought she was a goddamn saint because she lived in Washington and wore a fancy suit, accusing her of forgetting where she came from and who had supported her when she was nothing but a broken-down enlisted clerk with a failed marriage and a ruined knee. Her father slammed his massive hand onto the table, the force of the blow causing a plate to shatter as he stood up beside his favorite son, his chest heaving with a violent, patriarchal fury as he looked at Aaron with eyes that held no love, only an ancient, deep-seated hatred for the daughter who had finally dared to defy his authority, shouting that he had had enough of her arrogant, self-righteous military bullshit and demanding that she pack her bags, take her forged papers, and get the hell out of his son's house before he personally threw her into the street. "You are an embarrassment to this name," her father roared, his voice shaking the light fixtures above the table as her mother began to weep uncontrollably into a cloth napkin, the extended family sitting frozen in their seats like wax figures caught in the blast radius of a volcanic eruption. "We raised you, we fed you, we gave you everything you ever had, and you come into this house and try to destroy your brother's life because your own life is empty and bitter, you pathetic, selfish bitch." Aaron didn't flinch, her shoulders remaining perfectly square and her eyes steady as she looked through her father's rage, seeing it for what it truly was, the desperate, dying gasp of a small, insignificant man who realized that his power over her had expired years ago, her voice remaining as calm and unyielding as a stone wall, as she told him that she had given this family 18 years of her silence, her money and her compliance, but she would not give them her honor or her freedom to collateralize a criminal lie. "I didn't destroy this family, Dad," Aaron said, her voice carrying a weight of tragic authority that silenced his next insult before it could leave his throat. Her eyes turning toward the front hallway as the sharp, authoritative sound of the doorbell rang through the house twice, a cold, mechanical punctuation mark that signaled the arrival of the consequences Dany had spent a lifetime running from. "I just brought this family the one thing nobody in this room has ever had the courage to face, the total, unvarnished truth." The silence that followed the doorbell was heavy and suffocating, a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure that made it difficult to breathe as Aaron stood up from the table, smoothed the front of her uniform jacket with a slow, deliberate motion, and walked down the hallway toward the front door, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with a steady, military rhythm that sounded like a firing squad stepping into position. Behind her, she could hear Dany's voice drop into a terrified, breathless whimper as he looked out the front window and saw two unmarked, black government sedans parked on the cul-de-sac, their engines idling quietly in the rain, while three figures in dark, professional overcoats stepped out onto the wet asphalt. When Aaron opened the door, she was met by the calm, unblinking eyes of the lead investigator from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, flanked by a senior special agent from the Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Investigation Division, both men holding official leather credentials that gleamed under the porch light like badges of absolute authority. "Major Callahan, thank you for securing the site," the lead investigator said, his voice stripped of all drama, possessing that clinical, terrifying professionalism of federal agents who perform arrests not as an act of vengeance, but as a routine administrative function, stepping past her into the warm, garlic-scented air of the foyer with a warrant for the arrest of Daniel Callahan for federal procurement fraud, wire fraud, and the identity theft of a military officer. The scene that unfolded in the dining room was a chaotic, pathetic spectacle of collapsed illusions. Dany was found trembling behind the kitchen island, his hands shaking so violently he dropped his beer bottle onto the tile floor where it shattered into a pool of foam and glass, while his father tried to step between him and the agents, shouting a furious, incoherent tirade about constitutional rights and political persecution, until the IRS agent calmly informed him that interference with a federal warrant would result in his immediate detention in a regional holding cell. Aaron watched the agents lead her brother out of the house in handcuffs, his wrists bound behind his back by cold steel, his head bowed against the freezing rain, while his children watched from the upstairs hallway with wide, uncomprehending eyes, and her mother collapsed onto the living room sofa, her wails of grief sounding like the wind howling through a graveyard. Her father stood near the door, his face pale and deflated, looking old, broken, and utterly defeated by the realization that his golden boy was going to a place where family leverage and church connections meant absolutely nothing. Turning his head to look at Aaron with a gaze full of pure, unfiltered venom as she picked up her leather folder and prepared to walk out into the night. "You think you won something here today, Aaron?" her father whispered, his voice cracking with a bitter, senile malice that had no effect on her armor. "You're completely alone now. You have no family left. You're just a machine in a uniform, and when you die, nobody's going to remember the rank you pinned on your chest." Aaron stopped on the threshold, the cold wind blowing rain across her face as she looked back at the old man standing in the doorway of his son's collapsing house, her expression holding no hatred, no triumph, only a deep, clean sense of finality that felt like turning the key in a lock she had been trying to open for 20 years. "I was always alone in this family, Dad," Aaron said softly, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the rain as she adjusted the collar of her overcoat. "The only difference is now I'm finally free of the illusion that it was my fault." She turned her back on the house, walked down the driveway without looking back once, got into her rental car, and drove out of the suburban subdivision before the red and blue emergency lights of the departing federal vehicles had even faded from the wet asphalt of the cul-de-sac. She drove through the night, leaving the state of Ohio behind before the sun could rise over the steel mills of Youngstown, watching the gray industrial landscape transform into the rolling, forested ridges of West Virginia as the dawn broke through the clouds in a long, clean line of pale gold that felt like a personal welcome from the horizon. When she stopped for coffee at a small rest area, tucked into the mountains, her knees throbbed with that familiar airborne ache, but as she stood near the stone overlook, with a paper cup of bitter coffee in her hands, watching the morning mist rise off the river valleys below, she noticed that the chronic, suffocating tightness that had lived in her chest since childhood had completely vanished, replaced by a deep, clean exhaustion that felt like the end of a war rather than the start of an exile. The legal fallout from the raid developed with the slow, grinding inevitability of a federal prosecution. Dany's defense team attempted to leverage his lack of a prior criminal record to secure a probationary sentence, but the sheer volume of forged documents, combined with the clear, unyielding testimony provided by Aaron's security records, forced his hand into a comprehensive plea agreement that resulted in a 3-year sentence in a medium-security federal correctional facility in Michigan. His commercial entity collapsed within 48 hours of his indictment, his bank accounts frozen by federal asset forfeiture units, and his third wife filed for divorce before his first formal bail hearing had even concluded, verifying Aaron's long-held suspicion that when the false currency of a conman's lifestyle disappears, the people who loved him for his reflection vanish along with the money. Back in Akron, the social execution of the Callahan reputation was quiet, thorough, and entirely devastating to her parents' fragile ego. With her father quietly resigning from his volunteer positions at the parish council after the local newspaper published a small, clinical paragraph detailing his son's guilty plea to federal fraud charges, while her mother stopped sitting in the front pews at St. Jude's, retreating instead to the shadows of the back row, where she could avoid the polite, pitying looks of the Altar Society ladies who had once been her primary audience. Aaron didn't celebrate any of it, refusing to answer the 17 furious, weeping voicemails Dany left from the regional jail before his transfer to prison, and ignoring the manipulative texts from her mother that detailed her father's rising blood pressure and their struggles to pay for Dany's legal defense, knowing that any response on her part would simply reopen the door to the emotional parasitism she had finally excised from her life. By the arrival of the new year, Aaron had moved out of her temporary apartment and into a small, historic brick townhouse located on a quiet sidewalk in Old Town Alexandria, a neighborhood populated by retired civil servants, gray-haired federal judges, and quiet military veterans whose daily conversations centered around back surgeries, gardening techniques, and the fluctuating price of coffee rather than the toxic, competitive social metrics of her youth. Her home became a sanctuary of absolute silence and profound, uncomplicated peace, a place where every piece of simple wooden furniture, every book on the shelves, and every quiet hour of the evening belonged entirely to her, completely insulated from the threat of an emotional ambush or a family crisis designed to steal her peace for someone else's convenience. One rainy Saturday afternoon in April, while she was carefully unpacking her dress blues to hang them in the hallway closet, next to a small green snake plant she had bought for $15 at a local nursery, she found a handwritten letter from Hank that had been slipped into her uniform bag before she left Maryland, containing just 3 sentences written in his rough, trembling script that stated she had done the honorable thing, and that the only problem with honorable things is that they usually hurt like hell before they heal. Aaron sat down on the edge of her unmade bed and cried for 10 minutes, a quiet, gentle release of tears that held no anger, no resentment, and no grief, just the pure, physical relief of a soldier who has finally been allowed to lay her pack down on the floor after a march that lasted half a lifetime. 6 months later, while walking through the crisp autumn leaves under the orange canopy of the trees along King Street, she passed an outdoor cafe where a group of elderly female veterans were sitting together, their silver hair catching the sunlight while they laughed loudly over large mugs of coffee, their knees visibly stiff from years of service, but their eyes bright with an unyielding, collective strength that needed no validation from a name or a family bloodline. One of the older women, an army nurse who wore an ancient regimental pin on her lapel, caught Aaron looking and raised her coffee cup in a silent, knowing salute that Aaron returned with a genuine, beautiful smile that came from the very center of her chest, realizing as she walked on toward the riverfront that true strength had never been about enduring the people who hurt you simply because you shared their last name, but about having the courage to walk away into the sunlight. and finally learning how to stop losing to them.